Everybody, thank you very much for your patience. I think we're about good to go. Most of you will know Mark Roberts. He was 40 years running the Libraries Institute until he retired 2 years ago, and has spent his life studying the history of the English colony at Florence and many other things. And tonight he's going to talk to us about Walter Savage Landor. Mark, over to you.
In his little book, ABC of Reading, published in 1934, the American modernist poet Ezra Pound asked the questions, why isn't Walter Savage Landor more read? Has England ever produced an all-round man of letters of equal stature? Later on in the same book, Pound brackets Landor together with Chaucer and Shakespeare, a triumvirate to which he does not add a fourth. However, in a straw poll among my friends and family, I found that few people had ever heard of him, let alone read many of his works. Yet Landor is a literary colossus, straddling the 18th and the 19th century. No English writer is more classical, for he wrote with equal facility in Latin and in English, yet he had a fiery and romantic sensibility. His lasting monument is the 5 volumes of Imaginary Conversations in prose, but he also produced a considerable body of verse. Here is the once well-known lyric, Dying Speech of an Old Philosopher, which he composed on his 74th birthday. I strove with none, for none was worth my strife. Nature I loved, and next to nature, art. I warmed both hands before the fire of life. It sinks, and I am ready to depart. Slightly less well known, but similarly lapidary in manner, are these lines. Poet, I like not mealy fruit. Give me freshness and crispness and solidity. Apples are none the better overripe, and prime buck venison I prefer to tripe. Many have noted the extreme contrast between the Olympian calm of Landor's literary style and his furious, explosive temperament. Far from striving with none, he strove with everyone he came across. He knocked the hat off the head of an Italian marquis, his landlord in the Via Pandolfini, who had neglected to remove it in his presence, and at Villa Gherardesca, he flung his cook out of the window, to his immediate regret, for he had forgotten about the beautiful bed of violets beneath. I will now give a brief account of his early life until his arrival in Florence. He was born at Eastgate House in Warwick in 1775, the same year as Jane Austen and Charles Lamb. And on the 30th of January, the anniversary of the beheading of King Charles I, a circumstance that later accorded with his anti-monarchist sentiments. His father was a well-to-do physician, Dr. Walter Landor, and his mother, Elizabeth Savage. Both his parents owned extensive estates in the Midlands, and as the eldest son, Walter expected to inherit everything and look forward to a prosperous existence. This is not Landor, it's the young Cicero reading by Vincenzo Foppa. After private school at Knowle, he was sent to Rugby, whence he was removed at the request of the headmaster. He then studied privately with the Reverend William Langley. He was a clever child and read a good deal in English, Latin, and Greek. On one occasion, he netted and threw into the river a local farmer who had objected to the boys fishing on his property. At Oxford, he acquired a reputation as a mad Jacobin, partly because he wore his hair unpowdered, partly because of his enthusiasm for the French Revolution. From Trinity College, he was rusticated for discharging a gun at the closed shutters of a priggish Tory undergraduate. The college authorities were willing to allow him back, but he disdained to return and so took no degree. This caused a rift with his father. He then went to live in Tenby in Wales, where he had a love affair with a local girl, blonde Nancy Jones, whom he addressed poetically as Ione. She bore him a child who died in infancy and herself died young. In 1795, aged 20, he published a small book of English and Latin verses entitled The Poems of Walter Savage Landor. Of it, the poet Swinburne later wrote, "No poet at the age of 20 ever had more vigor of style and fluency of verse." As a matter of fact, Landor's style and fluency changed very little throughout his long life. He made peace with his family. His father gave him an allowance of £150 a year and told him that he could either live at home or elsewhere as he pleased. Landor decided to settle in South Wales, and it was in Swansea that he met Lord Aylmer and his beautiful 17-year-old sister Rose, whom he greatly admired. In 1798, Rose sailed with an aunt to India, where she died of cholera. This is her tomb in Calcutta. Landor immortalized her in a once famous poem. "Ah, what avails the sceptred race? Ah, what the form divine? What every virtue, every grace? Rose Aylmer, all were thine." Rose Aylmer, whom these wakeful eyes may weep but never see, a night of memories and of sighs, I consecrate to thee. Before leaving for India, Rose had lent Landor her copy of Clara Reeve's The Progress of Romance, containing the story of Caroba, Queen of Egypt. It gave him the idea for his long poem Gebir, about a prince of Spain who falls in love with his enemy, the Queen of Egypt. It was published anonymously in 1798, a few weeks before the lyrical ballads of Wordsworth and Coleridge, and was reviewed by the poet Robert Southey, who called it some of the most exquisite poetry in the language. When the name of the author became known, it made Landor's reputation. Here is a characteristic passage with Miltonic echoes. "But I have sinuous shells of pearly hue within, and they that lustre have imbibed in the sun's palace porch, where, when unyoked, his chariot wheel stands midway in the wave. Shake one and it awakens, then apply its polished lips to your attentive ear, and it remembers its august abodes and murmurs as the ocean murmurs there." He then worked as a journalist on the Morning Chronicle, denouncing the drunken democracy of Mr. William Pitt, the Tory Prime Minister. For the next few years, he led an agitated and unsettled life, mostly in London. In 1802, he went to Paris to see the First Consul Napoleon at close quarters, which cured him of his former hero worship. A second edition of Gebir appeared in 1803, and Landor translated the whole thing into sparkling Latin verses, which did little Landor certainly wrote with great facility in Latin, whether in prose. He used to say, "I am sometimes at loss for an English word, for a Latin, never." He traveled about the country, riddled with debts, and spent some time in Bath. There he met Sophia Jane Swift, from the same family as the author of Gulliver's Travels, whom he tried to persuade not to marry her cousin, and whom he addressed poetically as Ianthe, writing her some of his best short poems. His father died in 1805, and at last he was financially independent and began living in high style. He had a fine carriage, 3 horses, and 2 men. In 1808, Landor suddenly decided to fight against Napoleon in the Peninsular War, joining the Spanish National Army and paying out of his own pocket for the relief of Venturada. He saw no action, though he was made an honorary colonel. This Spanish adventure of his was a bit like Byron's in Missolonghi, some 16 years later, though luckily it ended with Landor's safe return to England. Poor Byron, on the other hand, died of fever and sepsis in April 1824. Before going to Spain, Landor had been looking for a country property to buy and had alighted on Llanthony Abbey, a ruined Augustinian priory in southern Wales near the English border, extremely picturesque. He now set about restoring it, planting trees, improving the roads, importing special sheep from Spain. His plan was to set himself up as a country gentleman, and obviously he would need a wife. At a ball in Bath, he set eyes on the pretty but empty-headed Julia Thuillier and immediately said, "That's the nicest girl in the room, and I'll marry her." On 24th of May, 1811, the 36-year-old Landor married the 20-year-old Julia at St. James's Church, Bath, and they settled in Llanthony. For a while, he was extremely happy in the red sandstone valley of his Welsh estate. "I have made a discovery, which is that there are both nightingales and glowworms in my valley. I would give 2,000 or 3,000 less for a place that was without them." Within a few years, as was to be expected, he found he had exhausted the patience of his frivolous wife, and moreover, he had spent his fortune in restoring and improving his estate. Not only had he quarreled with Julia, but he was embroiled in litigation with various tenants, bailiffs, lords lieutenant, and neighbors. The last straw was when he let his farmland to a certain Betham, who was incompetent and extravagant and paid no rent. So he decided to leave England and abandoned Llanthony to his creditors, principally his own mother. After 1 or 2 false starts, he and his quarrelsome wife set up house for 3 years in Como, where their first son, Arnold Savage, was born. "There are 2 miseries in human life: to live without a friend and with a wife," he wrote. In Como, Landor discovered to his great surprise that, unlike in England, in Italy, the Latin language did not provide protection against the laws of libel and slander. He got into trouble with the local censor, and thus with the Austrian authorities, over some of his Latin writings. By way of Pisa and Pistoia, Landor and his family proceeded in the summer of 1821 to Florence, where he was to remain for 14 years. Now that we have reached the point of Landor's arrival in the city, almost 200 years ago, I should like to step back and look at some of his shorter poems. Here is his witty epigram on Henry Dundas, 1st Viscount Melville, who was impeached in 1806. "God's laws declare, thou shalt not swear by aught in heaven above or earth below." "Upon my honor," Melville cries, he swears and lies. Does Melville then break God's commandment? No. And here is a charming pair of couplets about a minor poet called John Kenyon, who was a good friend to Landor and also knew Southey, Wordsworth, and Browning. Landor: Kenyon, I've written for your delectation a short imaginary conversation. Kenyon: Landor, I much rejoice at the report, but only keep your promise, be it short. Here are his lines on a quarrelsome bishop. No doubt Thomas Burgess, Bishop of St. David's, with whom Landor came into conflict at Lanthony. To hide her ordure claws the cat. You claw, but not to cover that. Be decenter and learn at least one lesson from the cleanlier beast. This is an epigram addressed presumably to Ianthe. Proud word you never spoke, but you will speak, for not exempt from pride, some future day. Resting one white hand on a warm, wet cheek, over my open volume, you will say, this man loved me, then rise and trip away. Landor himself was proud and made a virtue of his pride. In these lines, he refers to Cape Sunion in Attica, with its temple sacred to Poseidon. Wearers of rings and chains, pray do not take the pains to set me right. In vain my faults ye quote, I write as others wrote on Sunium's height. His pride could take the form of contempt for the vulgar masses. Call me not forth, said one who sate retired, whom love had once, but envy never fired. I scorn the crowd, no clap of hands he seeks, who walks among the stateliest of the Greeks. The best of his epigrams, sometimes in the modern, but more often in the Greek sense of that term, are distilled meditations on life and death. How soon, alas, the hours are over, counted us out to play the lover, and how much narrower is the stage, allotted us to play the sage. But when we play the fool, how wide the theatre expands, beside, how long the audience sits before us, how many prompters, what a chorus. Here is one of his many epitaphs on himself. Here lies Landor, whom they thought a goose, but he proved a gander. And here is yet another thought on death. Various the roads of life, in one all terminate, one lonely way. We go, and is he gone? Is all our best friends say. Leigh Hunt showed Landor a single hair from the locks of Lucrezia Borgia, stolen for Hunt by a mad acquaintance, possibly Lord Byron, from the Ambrosian Library in Milan. Landor produced a pair of couplets. Borgia, thou once wert almost too august and high for adoration, now thou'rt dust. All that remains of thee these plaits unfold, calm hair meandering in pellucid gold. The finely worked craftsmanship of that final line is most characteristic. We notice and admire the fine brushstrokes, like those of a miniaturist. In Florence, Landor initially took an apartment in the palace of a Count Palatine named Charles de Lutz, Italianized as Lozzi, in Via della Scala, not far from Santa Maria Novella. He paid a year's rent in advance. At first, all went well, for landlord and tenant shared an interest in art, and Landor bought from de Lutz 3 paintings that had once belonged to Sir Horace Mann, the British envoy at the Grand Ducal Court. One evening, however, when Landor was entertaining a young English painter called Trajan Wallace, who made this drawing, and they were talking together pleasantly on the balcony, the Count called out from his window that he was a sick man and they were disturbing his sleep. Landor was apoplectic with rage and immediately issued a challenge. The very next day, he wrote to the Grand Duke's secretary, Prince Rospigliosi, demanding the intervention of His Serene Highness. From Palazzo Pitti, the prince replied that it was hardly a matter for the royal court and referred him to the police commissioner for the Santa Maria Novella district. The result was that Landor wrote in his best Italian to the Presidente del Buon Governo, Signor Presidente, I have been advised by the Commissionary of Police to make your Excellency acquainted with an offense against the laws and customs committed by a certain Lutz who calls himself Count Lozzi. On Saturday evening from 9 to 10, the painter Signor Wallace was paying me a visit. We were speaking of a painting of his in the presence of my wife on the terrace, 65 paces from the terrace of the said Lutz. A few minutes after 10, this Lutz cried out, fine impertinence to disturb people from slumber at this hour. He was not asleep. The servants were passing in and out. I stepped forward, demanded an apology for the insult, and threatened the punishment he deserved. 3 doctors a short time back swore that this Lutz was gravely ill. I, during the same period, have seen him running across the terrace like a small boy. During the same period, he pinched the porter's daughter on the thigh and attempted other familiarities, as she told my servant. Hardly a sick man. During the same period, this invalid took into his service a young female very well known in the lobbies of the theatres. On Sunday, he dared to show himself publicly in the Via dei Servi, fresh, lusty, laughing, in perfect confidence. The affair petered out in a series of compromises, but Landor was able to break his lease on the Palazzo Lozzi, which perhaps had been his aim all along. In early November, he took a new lease on one of the palazzi owned by the Marchese de' Medici Tornaquinci in the Borgo degli Albizzi, not far from the Bargello. It was an immense palace with warm and cold baths and everything desirable. Landor furnished 14 rooms in his apartment at a cost of £600. His rent was under £50 a year. A few months later, there was another excitement when a chambermaid called Maria Santi brought criminal proceedings against Count Walter Savage Landor for having poured boiling hot water over her. The matter seems to have been settled out of court, but the police noted that Landor behaved with a maximum of scorn, insubordination, and irreverence, to the point that he had to be called to order. Around this time, Leigh Hunt arrived with his large family at Maiano. He described Landor as like a stormy mountain pine that should produce lilies. Mr. Landor's conversation is unaffected. His laugh is in peals and climbing. He seems to fetch every fresh one from a higher story. In 1826, Landor took his family for the summer to the Villa Castiglione, now Lambertini, in Via Chiantigiana on the south side of the river, situated on a vine-covered hill known as Poggio alla Mele. And in the autumn, they returned to another palazzo owned by the Marchese Medici Tornaquinci in Via Pandolfini, probably the house that is now number 16, back to back with the one in the Borgo degli Albizzi. There he had a furious argument with a window cleaner called Bronchelli and was sued for a trifling sum of money. At Christmas that year, Landor wrote to his mother, "We are very gay here at Florence. Last night we were at a private play given by Lord Normanby. He and Lady Normanby act admirably." One couple who especially enjoyed the Normanby amateur theatricals was the Earl and Countess of Blessington. Lady Blessington in particular was fond of literary society, and soon Landor was spending every evening at what she called her charming pavilion overlooking the Arno. Augustus Hare, the elder, wrote of her, "She is attentive, she is clever. She is affable, she is amusing. She is Irish, she has black hair." In her book, Idler in Italy, which appeared in 1839, Lady Blessington was highly complimentary about Landor. "There is a natural dignity which appertains to him that suits perfectly with the style of his conversation and his general appearance." Writing to his mother, Landor, for his part, praised Lady Blessington as the most remarkable woman with whom he had ever conversed. This is the superb portrait of her by Thomas Lawrence. One evening at the Normanby amateur theatricals, Landor got into one of his moods of uproarious hilarity in the interval between scenes. His stentorian laughter was still at its height when the next scene opened, Lord Normanby alone on the stage. Quite indifferent to or unconscious of the impropriety, he continued deafening the house, while Lord Normanby, in the best possible humor, unable to contain his smiles, waited quite patiently until Landor had laughed himself out. Lord Normanby delighted in Landor. A little later, the Earl of Blessington took Landor on his yacht, the Bolivar, for a short holiday in Naples, which city much delighted him. Those who have not seen it can form no idea of its beauty from anything they have seen elsewhere. He loved the ruined Greek temple at Paestum, calling it magnificent. But Grecian architecture does not turn into ruin so grandly as Gothic, he observed. Back in Florence, on his return from Naples, Landor became especially friendly with the Neapolitan Francesco Ricciardi, Conte di Camaldoli, whom he thought far friendlier than the Florentines. Just before the Landors moved out of the Via Pandolfini apartment, there occurred the already mentioned incident of the Marchese's hat, thus described by Seema Kirkup. "Mrs. Landor was sitting in the drawing room, where I and some others were, when the Marquis came strutting in without removing his hat. But he had scarcely advanced 3 steps from the door when Landor walked up to him quickly and knocked his hat off, then took him by the arm and turned him out. You should have heard Landor's shout of laughter at his own anger when it was all over. Inextinguishable laughter, which none of us could resist." Landor and his family spent the winter of 1827 to 28 in various Florentine lodgings, including the Casa Cremani at the Croce al Trebbio, where he violently kicked a carpenter named Giuseppe Pannucci and was reported to the police. Landor was obliged to pay the bill, but Giuseppe said he was tired of the ill treatment and would never work for Landor again. While he was staying round the corner at the Casa Castellani in Via dei Banchi, Landor had a fierce altercation with a picture framer called Natale Ussi, in whose shop he thought he spotted a painting that had been stolen from him. During the night, a note was stuck on the door of Ussi's shop, warning the English that the owner was a thief. Ussi insisted that the handwriting was Landor's. Eventually, he settled into the Palazzo Giugni, now Palazzo Fraschetti, Via degli Alfani 48, an elegant Mannerist palace by Bartolomeo Ammanati that became the Landors' final Florentine home before they moved to Fiesole. In the spring of 1824, Landor suddenly found himself banished from his adoptive city. What had happened was that he had dismissed a servant from Palazzo Giugni, and the man had retained the key and used it, so Landor thought, to gain admittance and steal some silver plate. Next morning, Landor reported the theft to the police, saying that he considered it his duty to do so, though of course he knew better than to expect the police to be of the slightest use, it being their policy when thefts are committed against foreigners to act so as to protect the thieves. The officer on duty was naturally indignant at this offensive speech, and next morning Landor was ordered to be out of Tuscany within 3 days. He appealed to the Grand Duke Leopoldo II, but in the meanwhile was obliged to leave Florence for the Bagni di Lucca, which at that time were outside the borders of Tuscany. Giulia wrote to Palazzo Pitti, "A wife, distraught and afflicted, makes this supplication. 4 tender and innocent children pray and implore the recall to Florence of their respective husband and father." This is a painting by Trajan Wallace. Fortunately, the Grand Duke took the whole matter good-humoredly and gave orders that Landor should be allowed back to Florence. But did he learn his lesson and learn to bridle his tongue? He did not. In August that year, with the help of a rich Welsh friend called Joseph Ablett, Landor purchased the Villa Gherardesca at San Domenico di Fiesole for 8,600 scudi from its owner Gatti, who had himself paid 6,400 for it less than 2 years previously. The property, now known as Villa La Torraccia, comprised some 84 acres, and there were 165 century-old lemon trees. It had historical and literary associations. Landor told Southey that his new purchase was a villa belonging to the Count Gherardesca of the family who led his women to bathe when they had left the first scene of their storytelling. Here I shall pass my life, long or short, no matter. His wanderings were now over for a while, and he seems to have been relatively happy. He set about making a garden, having seeds sent to him from England. At the Villa Gherardesca, Landor said, I have the best water, the best air, and the best oil in the world. My country now is Italy, where I have residence for life, and literally may sit under my own vine and my own fig tree. This is a reference to the Old Testament prophet Micheas, and every man shall sit under his own vine and his own fig tree. I have some thousands of the one and some scores of the other, with myrtles, pomegranates, gadgers, and mimosas in great quantity. Relative contentment did not, however, make him less quarrelsome, and before long he was engaged in an epic wrangle over water rights with his new neighbor, Monsieur Joseph Antoine, an attaché at the French legation. The case was in and out of the courts for a dozen years and was finally settled in 1842 at a cost to Landor of between £200 and £300. This dispute about water gave Charles Dickens the idea for the quarrel in Bleak House between Celesta Dedlock and Lawrence Boythorn, who is an affectionate caricature of Landor. Dickens, who was 37 years younger, wrote of him, talking, laughing, or snoring, his lungs made the beams of the house shake. And Landor wrote this complimentary little couplet. You ask me what I see in Dickens, a gamecock among bantam chickens. The archaeologist Austin Henry Layard who spent his childhood in Florence and later excavated Nimrud and Nineveh, provides us with a glimpse of Landor's family life. During these happy hours that passed on the Fiesole hills, I frequently saw Mr. Landor, who was always very kind to me. The strange life that he was leading and his eccentric character and quarrelsome disposition kept him aloof from the English residents at Florence, and neither he nor Mrs. Landor came to our house. In bringing up his children, he put into practice certain theories of his own. After the birth of Arnold in Como, Julia was born in 1820, the second son, Walter, in 1822, and the third son, Charles, in 1825. The four children, according to Layard, were allowed to run wild, nearly barefooted and in peasant's dress among the contadini. Almost before they could lisp, he began to teach them ancient Greek. They were not sent to school. Layard is wrong on this point. They did go to school in Florence. And the only time at which they were subjected to any kind of discipline was when his ungovernable temper was excited by something which they may have done to displease him, when he treated them very harshly. Well, this obviously was not a good method of child rearing, and it was no doubt responsible for many of the problems that later arose between Landor and his sons and daughter. He himself claimed that he loved all children. To see the happiness of children was always to me the first of all happiness, he said. These are not the Landors, I'm afraid. They're some random English children. The widowed Ianthe, the dearest of all the friends I ever had or ever shall have, came to visit Landor at the Villa Gherardesca on several occasions, making his wife rather jealous. Sophia Jane Swift had been widowed twice and had 3 daughters. One autumn evening after dinner in the villa, Landor led his guests up the hillside to a small square with the young mimosa at each corner. Here, said Landor, he had chosen his final resting place, and here he begged Ianthe and her 3 daughters to plant the mimosas that would shade his grave. With the help of Francesco the gardener, the planting was quickly carried out. He then composed another of his epitaphs. Lo, where the 4 mimosas blend their shade, in calm repose at last is Landor laid. For ere he slept, he saw them planted here, by her his soul had ever held most dear, and he had lived enough when he had dried her tear. I've said enough for the moment about irascible Landor's difficulties with tradesmen, landlords, neighbors, and the police, about his time in Florence and Fiesole, and it is time to return to literary matters. It was in Florence that he began and almost completed the series of imaginary conversations that are his chief claim to literary celebrity. They were published in 5 volumes between 1824 and 1829, others being added later. The idea of these dialogues had been conceived during Landor's childhood, as he later wrote. When I was younger, amongst the chief pleasures of my life, and among the commonest of my occupations, was the bringing before me of such heroes and heroines of antiquity, such poets and sages, such of the prosperous and unfortunate as most interested me, engaging them in conversations best suited to their characters. The imaginary conversations are in prose, for Landor once remarked, poetry was always my amusement, prose my study and business. Indeed, the critic de Selincourt gave it as his opinion that, as a writer of prose, none has surpassed him. The range of interlocutors is vast, and there are more than 150 of them. Among the Greeks, for instance, are Aesop and Rhodope, Pericles and Sophocles, Diogenes and Plato, Aristotle and Callisthenes. The Romans include Lucullus and Caesar, Virgil and Horace, Marcus Tullius Cicero and his brother Quintus Cicero. Then there are statesmen and sovereigns such as Richard I and the Abbot of Boxley, Fra Filippo Lippi and Pope Eugenius IV, Louis XIV and Père Lachaise, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. The series of famous women includes Beatrice and Dante, Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth and Cecil, Vittoria Colonna and Michelangelo. The miscellaneous series includes modern figures, many of whom were younger than Landor, Garibaldi and Mazzini, Pope Pio IX and Cardinal Antonelli. Perhaps the most magnificent of all are the Greek dialogues, for Landor was steeped in the Hellenic world, and his imagination responded ecstatically to the clear sunlight of Greece. There is a much anthologized passage about death in the dialogue Aesop and Rhodope. Aesop speaks, Laodamia died, Helen died, Leda, the beloved of Jupiter, went before. It is better to repose in the earth betimes than to sit up late. Better than to cling pertinaciously to what we feel crumbling under us and to protract an inevitable fall. We may enjoy the present while we are insensible of infirmity and decay, but the present, like a note in music, is nothing but as it appertains to what is past and what is to come. There are no fields of amaranth on this side of the grave. There are no voices, O Rhodope, that are not soon mute, however tuneful. There is no name, with whatever emphasis of passionate love repeated, of which the echo is not faint at last. In one of the Roman conversations, a speaker says, we cannot conquer fate and necessity, yet we can yield to them in such a way as to be greater than if we could. And here is a passage from Pericles and Esparza. There is a gloom in deep love, as in deep water. There is a silence in it which suspends the foot, and the folded arms and the dejected head are the images it reflects. No voice shakes its surface. The muses themselves approach it with a tardy and a timid step, and with a low and tremulous and melancholy song. The critic Rostrevor Hamilton comments on this passage. No one but Landor has drawn from the English language an effect of this kind, suggesting in its serenity and amplitude an Elysian repose. It requires the utmost delicacy to harmonize a quality so static and remote with the stir of human emotion. The beauty must not be flaunted. The elaboration must not be carried too far. Another prose work, the Pentameron, appeared in 1837. Some of the pages are too delicious to turn over, said Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Here is a passage in which Giovanni Boccaccio recalls a dream that he has had. My dream expanded and moved forward. I trod again the dust of Posillipo, soft as the feathers in the wings of sleep. I emerged on Baia. I crossed her innumerable arches. I loitered in the breezy sunshine of her mole. I trusted the faithful seclusion of her caverns, the keepers of so many secrets, and I reposed on the buoyancy of her tepid sea. Then Naples and her theatres and her churches, the grottos and dells and forts and promontories, rushed forward in confusion, now among soft whispers, now among sweetest sounds, and subsided and sank and disappeared. Yet a memory seemed to come fresh from every one. Each had time enough for its tale, for its pleasure, for its reflection, for its pang. In March 1835, Landor's friend Charles Armitage Brown came to dinner at the Villa Gheratesca. Two of the children, Arnold and young Julia, were present. During the dinner, Mrs. Landor reproached her husband for something he had done, and as she talked, the reproach became a more general attack upon his character. It was not the first time that Brown had heard Julia Landor blaming her husband, but on this occasion she became hysterical. She poured out her heart in language that Brown found shameful to recall and painful to hear for what seemed to him about an hour. Landor sat composed and silent until she seemed exhausted, when he said, "I beg, madam, you will, if you think proper, proceed, as I made up my mind from the first to endure at least twice as much as you have been pleased yet to speak." Strangely enough, the meal seems to have continued around them, but when Mrs. Landor at last withdrew from the dining room, Brown followed and remonstrated with her. This altercation was more than Landor could bear, and he moved out of the villa and into Florence. It was the end of their marriage. When the couple separated, Landor was 60 and his wife Julia was 44. He returned to England and remained there for 23 years. I will jump over this period because my plan is to concentrate on Landor's time in Florence. Very correctly and gallantly, he made over the villa to his wife and children. What brought him back to Italy in 1858 was a most unfortunate libel action. That year, he published a metrical miscellany entitled Dry Sticks Faggoted by W.S. Landor, in which he libeled two tiresome and disagreeable women who had behaved most ungratefully towards him. The verdict went against him, and he was vilified in the press. The violence of the newspaper's language against the 83-year-old culprit is quite astonishing. The Saturday Review, for instance, "Filth and obscenity are never so unnaturally nauseous as from the chattering lips of age, and a tottering and toothless satyr generally keeps his foul life and conversation to himself and his associates," etc., etc. No wonder Landor decided to leave England for Italy. At the Villa Gheratesca, however, he was coldly received by his wife and family, and his biographers all make the comparison with King Lear and his horribly ungrateful elder daughters. To his sorrow, he saw that his lovely burial plot had been destroyed and the mimosas uprooted. Alas, the little platform in which I hope to be buried has, in my absence, been leveled. He spent 10 miserable months at the villa, escaping several times, but always being brought back. Eventually, he was found by Robert Browning, prowling the streets of Florence like a disheveled lion, with no money at all. Browning took the old man back to Casa Guidi and set about securing an allowance from Landor's family in England. He then installed Landor in a cottage at Marciano outside Siena, where he was well looked after by the American sculptor William Wetmore Story and his family. There he was visited by Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Isa Blagden, and by the young American journalist Kate Field, who had an abundance of auburn hair, turquoise eyes, and a milk and roses complexion. Landor fell for her at once and began giving her Latin lessons. The Brownings' long-term plan, which they successfully and very kindly carried out, was to install Landor in Florence in the care of their faithful maid, Elizabeth Wilson, who had followed them to Italy from Wimpole Street at the time of their famous elopement in 1846. Since then, she had married an Italian, Ferdinando Romagnoli, and was living in Via Nunziatina, a few hundred meters from Casa Guidi. Wilson and her husband had the ground floor, and Landor was given 3 small rooms and a book closet on the first floor. The rent was £1 a week, and Wilson was to be paid £30 a year for looking after him. The street is now called Via della Chiesa, and the house is just opposite the Albergo Popolare, where drunks and homeless people are given shelter for the night. It was in this little house in Via della Chiesa, not far from Piazza Tasso, that Landor spent the remaining years of his life. In February 1864, the young Algernon Charles Swinburne traveled to Paris in company with his friend Lord Horton, previously Richard Monckton Milnes. After a few days, he left Horton in Paris and pressed on to Italy, armed with Horton's letter of introduction, specifically in order to pay homage to the great Walter Savage Landor in Florence. The 26-year-old Swinburne had a shock of red hair, but otherwise had a great deal in common with Landor, or so he thought. Both were Hellenists, both were atheists and Republicans, both idolized the second-generation Romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, 1792 to 1822. Swinburne was entranced by the notion of receiving the poetic torch from one who had been born in 1775 and might easily have known Shelley. In fact, Landor never did meet Shelley because he foolishly avoided him on account of his reputation for immorality, of all things, to his later regret. Swinburne's first meeting with Landor was not a success. The young poet wrote to Lord Horton on the 4th of March, 1864, "With much labor, I hunted out the most ancient of demigods at 93 Via della Chiesa, but although knockdown blows were not, as you anticipated, his mode of salutation, I found him, owing I suspect to the violent weather, too much weakened and confused to realize the fact of the introduction without distress. In effect, he seemed so feeble and incompatible that I came away in a grievous state of disappointment and depression, fearing that I was really too late." Apparently, he had thrown himself at Landor's feet and covered his hands with kisses, and the grumpy old man had been more bewildered than pleased. Swinburne's letter went on, "I wrote him a line of apology and explanation, to which missive of mine came a note of invitation, which I answered by setting off again for his lodgings. After losing myself for an hour in Borgo San Frediano, I found it at last, and found him as alert, brilliant, and delicious as I suppose others may have found him 20 years since." It may seem stupid of Swinburne to have got lost for an hour in Borgo San Frediano, especially as he had already been once to the house. But my guess is that people were not able to direct him very well, as the name of the street had only the previous year been changed from Via Nunziatina to Via della Chiesa. A few days after Swinburne's second visit, and while he was contemplating a third, Landor sent him a note addressed simply to Swinburne, Esquire. "My dear friend, so totally am I exhausted that I can hardly hold my pen, to express my vexation that I shall be unable ever to converse with you again. Eyes and intellect fail me. I can only say that I was much gratified by your visit, which must be the last, and I remain ever your obliged W. Landor." If Swinburne was disappointed by this second brush-off, he never said so. I suspect that he had already got what he wanted. Landor did have a few more visits from other admirers. When Augustus Hare the Younger came in late May, he too was confused by the change of the street name, but he identified the house because he recognized the pictures he could see through the first floor windows, just as he remembered them in Bath. These are the stairs, the only part I was able to photograph. Now, I have some nice photos of Landor, which I found on the National Portrait Gallery website. On one occasion, Landor rang for Mrs. Romagnoli at 2 o'clock in the morning, asking for windows to be thrown open and for pen, ink, and paper. Having written a few lines, he leaned back and said, "I shall never write again. Put out the lights and draw the curtains." Yet he was not to be trifled with. Many years before, as is well known, he had thrown his cook out of the window at the Villa Gherardesca. To show that the old volcanic fire still lived beneath its ashes, Thomas Adolphus Trollope cites another defenestration episode from this later period, in which Landor, having finished dinner, thinking that the servant did not come to remove the things so promptly as she ought to have done, gathered everything up in the tablecloth and bundled it out of the window. In mid-September, Landor had such a bad cold and a cough that he stayed in bed, something he never normally did. He had not eaten for 3 days when his younger sons, Walter and Charles, arrived separately to visit him on Saturday the 17th. Landor said he would take a pill for his cough, then changed his mind, then tried to take a drink, then laid down his head and died. He had written, "Death stands above me, whispering low, I know not what, into my ear. Of his strange language, all I know is there is not a word of fear." He was buried in the Protestant cemetery outside Porta a Pinti in what is now Piazzale Donatello. The funeral was conducted by the Reverend I.H.S. Pendleton, the Anglican chaplain. Only Landor's 2 younger sons were in attendance. Of his own literary reputation, he had prophesied, "I shall dine late, but the dining room will be well lighted, the guests few and select." Landor was the intemperate champion of temperance, the furious defender of serenity and sweet reasonableness. He was a great but neglected writer whose works are overdue for reappraisal. I hope that within the compass of a British Institute lecture, I have managed to convey something of his forceful and wayward personality. Thank you.
So, thanks for staying with it. And as it's our normal practice, we'll now open it up for questions. So if you would like to ask a question, feel free to put your video on, unmute yourself and ask a question. Or if you prefer, you can do it in the chat, which I will read out. Not seeing anything in the chat just yet. Lots of very positive thanks and bravissimi and stuff. Lots of praise, Mark. You've got a big fan base out there, but we knew that. So who'd like to say something? Anyone?
I'll start if you like.
Who we got there?
Penny.
Yeah, Penny, hi.
Hi. Yes, so I was fortunate enough that my school was actually based in Landor House in Warwick. And at that time, we were never told anything about his poetry at all. But it's now been moved to another much larger place. And they've actually called it the Landor Association. And they are indeed promoting him as, you know, the great writer that he was. So it's things have moved on. And I think he is beginning to become recognized again. Does that make sense?
Right. Well, because he started in Warwick and ended up in Florence. Yeah. I think they've made a Landor house. Did you say a Landor Association running it in Warwick?
Yes.
There's not a lot in Florence. On the other hand, there's as I think you may have seen in Via della Chiesa, there's a plaque on the wall calling him Epico Cuore and promoter of Florence.
They've actually redecorated the house and made it look a bit better as well. It was pretty much
good.
a mess when I first moved down. Yeah. but it's good to see it recognised. So thank you very much for all that extra information. It's great.
Thank you.
In the chat, Vanessa wonders what on earth happened to the poor woman who got thrown out the window.
Well, it was a man, not a woman. I think he wouldn't have. He was very gallant. He wouldn't have thrown a woman out the window. He was said to be writhing in agony when Landor put his head out of the window and hit his forehead and said, "Dio mio, I've forgotten about the violence."
Do you have any theory as to why he was quite such an irascible and mad, bad, and dangerous and no kind of chap?
Yeah, he had a very short fuse. I don't know why. I expect he was born with it.
Okay. Yeah. Yes,
It's
please.
Ari and St Albans.
So Ari first, and then Fenella. Ari and then Fenella. Ari first.
I know Shantoni Abbey very well.
Yes.
I have a house. I never heard that connection with Walter Landor at all. They really should make something of it.
Yes. Is there a house near the Abbey? The photographs I found of it just showed a ruin. It didn't show a house. But I think in his day, there must have been a dwelling attached to it.
Yeah.
I mean, he couldn't have lived in the ruin.
You can. There's a pub and a hotel in the ruin that you can stay in. So I don't know. We'll find out.
Well, perhaps that was his house.
Fenella.
Hello, I enjoyed your talk very, very much. I'm terribly interested in his picture collections, partly because of what is still in the Christchurch picture collection. And
well, he was very gullible. He bought a lot of fakes, but he was generous with his pictures. He was always giving them away. I think he gave one to Swinburne, which turned out to be a fake.
But what I wanted to know is that because his archives are scattered everywhere, I mean, the Americans have bought a bulk lot of his papers, and I understand there are papers in 2 or 3 places in England. What is in the Florence archives specifically about his picture collection? Do you know?
I don't know that there's anything about his picture collection. The Florence archives are mostly concerned with the police reports. The American scholar R.H. Super did a lot of work on the Florentine archives, but as I say, that was mostly about the police reports. You know, because he was always falling into disastrous conflict with local tradesmen or landlords. So there's a lot about his dealings with the police, but I'm not aware of anything about his paintings in Florence.
Do you know, or how can I find out what happened to the collection that on your talk, which I found really good, he had in Bath? We have an account of his picture collection in Bath. Then it seems that he brought it back to Florence. Is that correct?
Well, it is correct in the sense he took some of his pictures to Florence on his first European trip, but evidently he had some other paintings in Bath that he must have acquired after leaving Florence, because Augustus Hare the Younger says that he recognized the house in Via della Chiesa from the pictures that he remembered in Bath. So some of the pictures were probably bought in England and then brought with him to Florence for his second Florentine stay.
And I don't want to hog your valuable time, but it's such a wonderful chance to talk to someone about him. Do you have any idea, because of the work you've done on him, why he was particularly interested in the early Italian masters?
No, I think it's interesting that he was, though, because, as you know, the taste in that time was not so much for the early ones. They all loved painters like Guido Reni and 17th century ones a lot more. Landor was unusual in having a taste for early Italian paintings, for the old masters, the 14th and 15th century ones.
And is there any way of finding out why? Was it because they were cheaper, or because they were part of an
cheaper? Certainly, because they were less sought after.
And was he interested in the historiography of painting? So looking at what happened before the popular period of the 16th and 17th century?
Yes, I think he was. And he liked to, he didn't like clutter. In his houses were decorated fairly, in the Florentine manner, fairly spare, with very simple pieces of furniture, good quality. The only thing that he did go over the top on were paintings. He had lots and lots of paintings on the walls. But his taste in furnishing was fairly unusually austere for that period.
Thank you very much indeed.
We'll move on to a couple. I think we'll move on to a couple in the chat. Valeria asks if the Villa La Torraccia is now the Scuola di Musica in Fiesole. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Yes.
And the house that he lived in, the house that he called Villa Gherardesca, is now La Torraccia, and it's now the Scuola di Musica. So if you go to San Domenico, you take a right, and at the end of that road, you come to it on the right.
The British Institute of Florence has a partnership with the Scuola di Musica di Fiesole, so that's nice. Yes.
Oh.
And a question from Alice: how did Lillian Whiting gain his trust? Was it via the Brownings?
Who? Lillian Whiting?
Lillian Whiting.
Yes, I think through the Brownings. I'm not sure. I think through the Brownings. Of course, Mrs. Browning, died fairly shortly after Landor got back. I'm not quite sure when she died, but certainly before he did. And then Browning left Florence altogether.
But it was interesting to hear how much Browning went out of his way to look after Landor when he was in distress, and that was impressive.
He was extremely kind to him, and I think Browning felt that he owed a debt of gratitude to Landor, and he felt also that Landor was underappreciated by the English.
Presumably, we have most of the Landor's books in the Institute's collection, do we?
We have a wonderful collection in the library, yes, indeed.
And probably good editions as well. So next time you're in Florence and anyone who wants to follow up, you know where to look for them. It's all there.
That's right. And also biographies. Several good biographies are in the library.
Yeah. I think that the great Landor revival is starting tonight. Mark, thanks for your intervention.
Let's hope so.
Yeah, indeed. Are there any more questions? Because we've run a bit over the time because of the kerfuffle at the beginning. Whilst you're thinking of your questions,
I've got a question.
Yes, okay. Felix, yes.
Yeah, Felix, yeah. I was wondering if you could give us a view on as to why Landor's become less popular, or so much less popular than he once was. Maybe an opinion about that, and maybe a view on whether Ezra Pound's ringing endorsement of Landor that you mentioned at the start of the lecture has anything to do with that or not. But very grateful for any views on that. Thank you.
Well, I mean, literary fashion is such a strange thing, isn't it? People come in and out of fashion. Possibly he was overpraised in his lifetime. I don't think so, though. And as you say, maybe the endorsement by Pound was a bit of a double-edged sword. Not everybody would take Pound as a guide to the literary canon. Pound certainly made very high claims for Landor. Mentioning him in the same breath as Shakespeare and Chaucer.
Indeed, indeed. I'm going to put in my regular weekly plea for donations. If you've enjoyed the talk and wish to support the Wednesday lecture series and the Institute as a whole, any amount you feel you could donate would be most appreciated. So I will put up the link to Just Giving. And if we have any other last questions.
So I've got one.
Yes. Yes.
Mark, very good lecture. Thank you very much. I was just wondering what the connection, I might have missed it, but what was the connection with Bath? Because, I mean, I don't know whether he followed fashion a bit, but Bath, you know, at the time when he lived in Bath, had sort of fallen out of fashion a bit. And
yes, well, I think he loved Bath. It was where he met his wife. He spent, well, as soon as he had money from after his father died, he set himself up in Bath. He seems to have liked the west of England in general. As we know, he stayed in South Wales. He was born in Warwick, and then he spent quite a lot of time in Bath.
Did he ever come across Beckford?
Not that I know of. But he could have done easily, of course. I think Beckford died in the 1820s, did he?
Yes, that's right. A little bit after that. Yeah, yeah.
Or perhaps a bit later.
Yeah, yeah. But no, thank you very much.
No, I don't know that he ever met Beckford.
Okay.
I could look up quickly in the index of his biography.
But just as the Beckford was a bit of an eccentric, and
there's a huge entry on Bath, but there's nothing on Beckford.
Oh, okay.
In this book by Malcolm Elwyn, you see Landor Replevin. That's one of the best biographies, published in the 50s.
Oh, great, lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Any more for any more? In which case, it just remains for me to remind you that next Wednesday we have Lisa Cabarica on power and sexuality in Renaissance painting, which will be fascinating. And next Tuesday, don't forget to sign up for the guided reading of the Divine Comedy led by Alex Florence, which comes very strongly recommended. There's still a few places available for that. All details on the website and in the What's On Monday. So thank you all for your forbearance and staying with us through the sticky patch for what turned out to be a really, really interesting lecture from Mark. We will do a clean recording with the images so that we can put it on the YouTube, and we'll put the link to that recording in the What's On Monday. So you've got 2 or 3 days, Sarah and Mark, to sort that out. Thank you very much. I think it just remains for me to thank Mark very much indeed for a wonderful lecture, so for your support with this, and to all of you, our friends and followers and alumni all over the world, for joining us once again for Wednesday lecture on the Zoom with the British Institute. And we'll try our level best to make sure there's no further technical snafus. All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.